again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Design Deconstructed. This is episode 6 and the first playthrough of content that I created for the second expansion for Guild Wars 2, Path of Fire. As with Heart of Thorns, my role on this team was story design team lead. Just as with the first expansion, that means that I was tasked with overseeing the implementation efforts for the mainline Path of Fire story. And I was put in charge of about 4 to 6 designers again over the course of the development. Just as with Heart of Thorns, Path of Fire had its share of challenges in the areas of staffing, and we had some significant story rewrites. Not only did we lose some designers early on and writers as well, but Colin Johansson, our game director, departed the company, as did Leah Hoyer, our narrative director, which definitely put us in a difficult position of having to adjust to those changes and the ramifications of those departures. These were not easy people to lose by any means. On a project of this scope, those two directors were central to what we were trying to do with the story. I think the team, though, did an admirable job of stepping up and pulling together and making this expansion, and in particular, the story, one of our best releases ever. So despite the challenges that we had, we weathered the storm and overcame that adversity, and the product was by and large well received and got very good critical acclaim. So I think we did a very, very good job. Similar to my responsibilities with the previous expansion, I took ownership over a sizable number of chapters at certain points. Specifically, after we lost some of the designers on the team, I ended up taking over a number of story instances and at least getting them to a point where we could play them before we got some new key hires that we then put on the project midway through production. And so then after we got those people on board, I was able to step back and fall back to owning only 3 chapters. Even this, I think at some point may have been too many to keep, as my responsibilities on the team and my authority as the story design team lead had grown in scope from Part of Thorns. I was becoming more comfortable with the role, but at the same time, that meant that I was given more authority, more responsibility, more things to have to track. And so my scope grew in terms of leadership and management tasks, and that meant that I had a little less time for full implementation efforts. So in hindsight, I probably could have done a better job balancing that, but at the same time, I think I was kind of reluctant to give up some of the chapters that I wanted to continue to own. So that's what ended up happening. Thankfully, I had an amazing network of support from the team. They really picked up the slack, especially one of the things that happened during development of Path of Fire was my father passed away. I ended up having to go down to Arizona to help with settling his affairs, getting his house sold, all of the things that you need to do when one of your parents passes away. It took me away from the studio for about 2 weeks, I think, two weeks and change, and so that was tough. But the team picked up the slack, and I was able to delegate a lot of work out that way, and so that was something that I was actually really proud to come back and realize that, hey, they didn't, nothing fell apart. The train didn't come off the tracks, so that was really awesome. I also had tremendous support from our production team. Other designers and team leads, especially I will mention Sarah Sperry, who was our open world design team lead. She was an amazing partner to have. The two of us did a lot of communication and coordinating, and we worked closely with the game director, Mike Z, and Mike O'Brien as well, who had been put in the interim position as game director for most of Path of Fire. We worked with both Mikes quite a bit because they were central to sort of guiding the entire expansion and setting the vision and helping us maintain it. I will say, like, there are moments in your career where you can point, to a point in the past and say, well, this was a truly special moment. And I think with Path of Fire, that's what happened. We had an amazing team. We all gelled together really well. We created something amazing. I think we had a really awesome, I mean, from the very beginning of Path of Fire, we were doing team lunches, and we were always communicating with each other, and it was just it was a really special time. And so Path of Fire, I think, will always be one of those highlights of my career. Um, anyway, I truly believe in the saying that you only get one shot to make a good first impression. Um, and so, with that in mind, I made sure that I had ownership over the first story chapter called Sparking the Flame. So, that's what we're going to take a look at today. Um, this chapter went through a great number of iterations, actually. None of the early prototype versions of this mission were particularly different or very far from what we ended up shipping. But there was so much feedback on this chapter, from the encounter with the Forge at the beginning to the Herald and her role, how much action to have versus how much we needed to teach the players about mounts, and at times I felt like we never would find a way to please everybody because there were so many different competing elements for this chapter. But I was pretty steadfast in my desire to make sure that we addressed everything that we could, um, and that it was really super important to get this right. That it was our first impression of people's first impression of this expansion, um, and we wanted to make sure that we get players into the Crystal Desert as quickly as we could possibly get them in there, into the open world in particular, so that they could experience the joy of movement and the sense of exploration that were the sort of hallmarks of this expansion. We were introducing mounts, which changed the way that players could move and interact with the environment, and so that was critical. We didn't want to bog players down in a lengthy story chapter and force players to have to jump through a lot of hoops to get out into the world and jumping around on the raptor right away. So we tried everything we could to make that as smooth a transition into the world as possible. Yeah, because of all of the changes and everything that happened, there is a lot to talk about in this chapter. So let's go ahead and get started with Sparking the Flame. All right, here we are, Lion's Arch. This is where Path of Fire story begins. There's a short little instance here that we can jump into, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit about this. So we really struggled to figure out how we were going to start this expansion, and this opening went through quite a number of changes. There was at one point a world tour, as I like to call it, where you were checking in with all of your respective members of Dragon's Watch across the world. You were going to go visit everybody and say your goodbyes and try to recruit people to the desert, and all of them either were on their way there, in the case of Casimir and Ritlock and Canuck, who we'll find out later they're all headed to the desert, or they would give you some excuse, like Marjorie says that she was being tasked by the Queen to do something specific. I can't remember what it was, but there was just this, I don't know, it ended up feeling like busy work, and so we ended up cutting it because it seemed like a lot of work to do to get into the expansion. And as I had mentioned in the intro, our goal with this was to continue to try to make it as streamlined as possible so that you could get into the desert sooner rather than later. So that didn't suit the design goals that we had to have the player jumping around and waypointing from place to place. So we did not do that in the end. Even though I ended up setting all of that up, and there was a hugely complicated scripting routine that was running in the background to check who you had seen first, because if you went to see Casimir first and then you went to see Marjorie, the dialogues were supposed to change based on that, and vice versa, because Kaz and Jory obviously are our couple in our game, but they don't always see eye to eye, and right now they're kind of in a different strained place in their relationship. So there was that to deal with. So I ended up implementing a bunch of that stuff, and it didn't get used, and so unfortunately it was work that ended up on the cutting room floor, but that's part of the process as well. And then after the world tour, we did what I call the action instance, where you ended up meeting with the people who were going to the desert somewhere in Lion's Arch. I think it was down by the big giant lobster statue thing. Um, and you were sort of talking to them about Balthazar being in the desert, and you were going to head over that direction. And then a refugee ship arrives in the harbor, and it sinks, and you have to rush out with your partners and go, save people from drowning. And they're at the end of a very long journey, and so they can't swim, and so you have to help them get to shore. And there was an attempt to again add and inject some action right off the bat. But again, that also felt like it was sort of filler material because it didn't really have a bearing on the story, and it was also still preventing you from getting to the desert. So we ended up doing this kind of real short version. I still think that some of the people in the upper management of ArenaNet didn't like how long it took even to say our farewells here, but that is what it is. I think we need to have something, a bit of a prologue, because otherwise it would feel a little bit jarring, because we needed to sort of set up why you're getting on Keel's airship to go to the desert. So yes, we'll go in, we'll talk to Keel. This is a pretty simple, straightforward thing, but it's a simple setup, but I kind of like the idea of kind of pushing the player to walk with Keel and go on this little mini loop around the refugees. These refugees were added to the open world, I think, a couple weeks or some amount of time before the expansion came out, to again suggest that the refugees have been fleeing Alona, which is an indication to the people here that Alona is no longer being blockaded, that they have now been able to get people out. Because the story had been that once Palawa Joko took over down in the south, in the Crystal Desert region, he had locked the area down and was not allowing anybody in or out. But now with Balthazar down there causing havoc, we will obviously find out later that Joko was duped by Balthazar and trapped in the domain of the lost. And so he is no longer in charge, and without Palawa Joko's, inevitable power, people were able to start leaving. And so refugees started fleeing Alona in trying to get away from Balthazar in his campaign of destruction against Kropatorik. And so we have all that set up. And so the refugees are here. So this is just a little bit of a, again, it's a preamble. It's a neat little character moment with Keel, who is one of my favorite characters. I'm glad that we got to revisit her here and give her an office finally, which is one of the things that I helped work with the environment art team on what should be in her office. The banner of her, right? Because these were from content that I built, where you had to vote for her in the election that we had in Living World Season 1, which is awesome. I still think of that as one of my favorite releases. I want to talk a little bit here about Keel's assistant. This is an example of developers getting really creative. So we had these two characters, Keel and her assistant, who are going to have this, sort of conversation after you deal with Keel. And we got the voice back, and we realized that they had cast Debbie Derryberry, who, if you don't know, is also mainly the role of Tiny. Now, if you know Debbie Derryberry's voice, it's pretty obvious who she is, right? She has a pretty distinctive voice. And so this sounded like Tiny talking to Keel. And we had a moment with Tiny talking to Keel earlier in this chapter, 2 minutes ago. And so it was odd, right? Like, Debbie Derryberry does an amazing job as Tiny, but here, she sounded pretty much like Tiny. And so that really didn't fit. And so what we did is we had the audio team take a pass at making her voice really deep, which I think works pretty well. It's still Debbie Derryberry as speaking these lines here, but she's been pitched down quite a bit. So her voice is not super recognizable. And so then I went in and then made this super tall, huge drink of water lady, because I needed somebody who fit, that kind of voice. And she is almost Norn height. I definitely made her taller than your average human by far. Um, you know, so anyway, it's one of those little behind the scenes things. These bonus dialogues that pop up after with Lord Farron, who is an amazing character. Just I love talking to him anytime he's available. We wanted to have some of these characters in here to establish that, um, you know, there's plenty of people who are staying behind, and we're the only ones going to the desert. Or at least that's what we think at this point in the story. Um, these are a holdover from that world tour because a lot of these characters were at different points along the world tour. Like Sheriff Terma, I think, was not in LA. I think she may have been in Divinity's Reach. Or no, Farron was in Divinity's Reach. That's right. Ogden was at the Priory. Magnus was here, as was Terma. But they were in different places in Lion's Arch, and so you had to go different places. And it's, yeah. Anyway, we ended up recording all these dialogues, so we didn't want to waste them. So I added them here as bonus dialogues that you can have with these characters after the fact. I'm not going to get into it because, that's all extra story stuff that I don't need to have a lot of setup for. All right. Quickly, we're going to head back to the airship before I waypoint over there because I don't want to waste time doing the whole traveling on foot. There was a huge bug that I found when I was doing this chapter, that these green arrows that appear in a city to lead you to your next quest destination were utterly broken in Lion's Arch. They kept pointing me over here, and then it would loop back around and put you back in, and it basically led you in a circle. And so I had to reverse engineer. No one at the company, no one at the studio knew how that system worked anymore. Yay, because the person that had done a lot of that work was no longer at the company, and so I ended up having to re-engineer it, reverse engineer it, and then re-engineer it, and re-plug in all these nodes. Basically, there's just a series of nodes that are laid down throughout the city, and there's code in the background that looks at the quest system and says, oh, your destination is here, let me find the closest way to get there. And so now it actually leads you properly, but it didn't for quite a while until I worked down that system. So anyway, I'm not going to run my way all the way over here. So for this expansion, we added this airship. I requested that we add this airship. It's Keel's airship, the Phoenix Dawn. I wanted it to be a permanent part of the city moving forward. Unfortunately, I asked for it to have an airship dock, and I got a gangplank. That's what happens sometimes. It's not a knock on the environment art team. It's just they were super busy with everything else that they were doing, and they didn't have time to build an airship dock in LA, and I totally get that. So, this is sometimes what you end up asking for is not always what you get, but it works. It's fine. Talk to Fitus here. That's an optional dialogue. I'm only talking to him again so that you can hear that this is again an example of how this is obviously Bram's voice actor doing Fitus for Crush. I think he did Fitus before he did Bram, so it's not necessarily something we could have avoided doing. I think we tried to get his voice pitched down and it didn't sound right. He has the Char sort of lip flappy sound effects added to him, so he sounds a little less Bram than anything, but yeah. All right. let's hop into the instance. This was a challenge. So getting from the loading screen to the cinematic and to the moving platform without the kind of 1 or 2 frame hitches that we almost always have to deal with was not an easy task. And I didn't want these hitches because there is literally map travel happening between Lion's Arch and a very distant location. And if you saw your character on the airship before you saw the cinematic of the airship departing, it's not the end of the world, but it's certainly not great. It's not a great presentation thing. And we didn't really have anything, so I had to work with the cinematic animators and the code folks, the engineers, and we got a little piece of tech that allowed us to set actions when a cinematic was preloading and not actually loading, which, you know, allowed me to then have the load screen not bleed into this. And so you get this nice cinematic ends, you have a black screen, and then you finally see your character in the world. We wouldn't have been able to do that without new tech, strangely enough. But it seems kind of silly to do a bunch of work to do something as simple as that, but at the same time, I think presentation is really important, and having that 1 split second where you see your character in the environment that you're not supposed to be at yet is jarring. So yeah. I had a lot of fun setting up these sort of like falling rocks, falling pieces of the pyramid as you fly in on the airship. It's really, really cool to be able to do stuff like that. It's very cinematic. It's my style thing. One thing to note about these line guards who just exited the airship, they're not actually exiting the airship. They're teleporting and then pretending to exit the airship, because moving platforms are a really interesting piece of technology, and they aren't really, they're a moving piece of nav mesh, but this gangplank is a player collision object only. And so they can't walk on it to get off the airship. And so I have to teleport them to a point here in space. And thankfully, something about our pathfinding system allows NPCs to exist in space for a little brief moment of time. And so I teleport them into space and then tell them to move on their path, which is the first node of the path is here on the pyramid. So they can cross that distance in midair, technically, and then they complete their journey. Yeah, it's really interesting the kinds of weird things that you have to do in game development sometimes. There was a lot of headaches as well with starting this instance on a moving platform. I can't really show it because I would need to go into like developer mode, which I no longer have access to, sadly. But basically, the way that you structure this stuff is that the airships spawned out here in space where it starts, and so everything has to start on the airship. The NPCs have to start on the airship. The player start location has to start on the airship. Everything has to be attached to this thing that technically is out in the middle of space. And so you have to kind of like eyeball it and get it lined up just right, because there's not a really good way to do that. And this tech also is unreliable, and so this moving platform had a lot of jittering issues for a long time. You would just like get seasick just coming down on that path. The path would change every time I made a change to the path. It would revert, and so I'd have to do the path every time I wanted to update the path. I basically had to do it from scratch of the airship, which was not fun. And the last thing is, a lot of times the characters weren't attaching correctly to the moving platform. So either the airship would float off, leaving all of the NPCs standing in midair behind it, or the NPCs would fly off into space while you stood on the airship. It was not, yeah. Moving platforms in our game were never a great thing. All right. Anyway, moving on. Getting down here into the line, following line guard. Another thing I would say about the thing is having to contend with the fact that players could glide off of that airship, or later if they want to get the Griffin, being able to fly off of that airship platform created a lot of headaches for me to have to contend with, because I didn't, there's a lot of things that are set up just so, with the timing of the visual effects of the, the pyramids crumbling and the sound effects and everything, and all of that is dependent on the player being on the airship. And the minute the player decides, I want to glide off of this thing, then everything kind of breaks, and I have to manually trigger everything, and it's not a neat presentation if you do that. So if you're a player and you want to jump off the airship early, just know that you're kind of ruining your own experience. I'm sorry to say. It's, well, not ruined, but it's not as ideal. It's not hand tuned. It's not artisanal if you jump off the airship. So don't jump off the airship. All right. A little bit of quick note on the Forged. I think the Forged, this is our first introduction to the Forged as an army, and I think it's a much better introduction for these guys than we did with the Mordrum Guard. I think these were a much better army in terms of balance and difficulty and variety of things that they did. I mean, I will say at this point, the thing that hampered us with the Mordrum was the AI system, which was still fairly new, and a lot of it was prototype only. And now we had a better mastery of the AI system, and so I think the Forge benefited from that greatly, and they were able to have a bunch more things that they could do, and so they are a much stronger, I think, introduction for an enemy army. Now we've got the Herald coming in. Herald was an interesting character. She went through a lot of iterations herself. One of the big ones is that she used to be really, really wordy. She used to have a really long speech here at the top that went through your whole history with Balthazar and why he was upset at you and all of this. And it was about 12 seconds, I think, of just nonstop, chatter from her. Just her, right? Before you even got to say a word in, like, she had like 12 seconds of talking. Which is a lot. It's a lot of talking for an enemy NPC. There was some back and forth on this where we ended up going 180 degrees in the other direction and made her really say nothing at all and then just be immediately hostile. But that felt wrong and bad for other reasons, because we kind of wanted her to sort of make a play at offering the PC a place at Balthazar's side, because Balthazar, has at least some grudging respect for what the commander has done in killing Zaitan and Morjamoth. And so he's obviously on a campaign to kill Krapatork, so he's looking at the player as a potential ally, if they can be swayed to his way of thinking. I mean, they do stop him from, in the previous Living World season, they stop him from attaining his goals with two of the Elder Dragons, the Fire and Ice Dragons, Jormag and Primornis. But Balthazar is a tactician, and so he believes that, the PC, the commander, could be a very strong weapon in his arsenal if he was able to convince them of the righteousness of his cause. Obviously, the commander wants none of that, and we have the Herald at least make the offer, but the player shoots it down pretty quickly, and so we end up in a fight instead. There was a lot of different versions of this fight as well. What we ended up shipping is less I think, a fight and more of a theatrical performance. That's how I kind of thought of it. Is the Herald definitely is a challenge that I don't think you're quite capable of overcoming at this point. I mean, it's literally scripted so that you cannot win this fight. Most players will never encounter the conditions that preclude you from that, because she will run through her sequence of killing the civilians long before players get her down to the health threshold that I have her set to run away at. But even so, like, it's very much a performance than it is an actual boss fight. And we did it deliberately because she is a big bad, and we didn't want to just have you, wipe the floor with her, and we didn't want her to wipe the floor with you either. So it really is. It's more of a, she comes in, makes you an offer, fights you a little bit. When she realizes that you're not conducive to her way of thinking, she decides to call a tactical retreat and continue to taunt you and jab you in the area that she knows you're going to be kind of weak in, which is your compassion for other people. And spoilers, the reason she does that is because the Herald of Balthazar is in fact Devona, a corrupted version of a heroic figure from Guild Wars 1. We will find that out later in the next chapter. There's hints of it. We don't really ever come out and say it so much, but there's definitely lots of hints. There's one in this chapter where she says a line that is literally straight up ripped from what she said in Guild Wars 1. And then in Chapter 3, where we are infiltrating one of the forged camps, we see some notes and letters that she and Balthazar had, or that she had written to Balthazar's other generals, explaining her position and, a little bit. And she talks about her father, which is one of the key things that we learn about Devona in Guild Wars 1. So there's a lot of things. So we had some real fun kind of playing with this character and how she would, as a former hero now turned villain, how she would sort of approach the PC and sort of wage a psychological battle against what she knows the PC would be, which is a hero. So she's trying to make the player feel less heroic by killing these civilians. And I give a quick shout out here to, gosh, I'm blanking on the name. Owen McIndoe, one of our engineers who was working on Path of Fire with us. He gave us dynamic instance boundaries for this expansion. That made developing and building content like this so much easier, because now I had fine control over where the player was going to be, where I could keep things behind the scenes, and how we ever got content built without that, to this day I don't know, because it was such a hugely useful tool once we got it, that I was so thrilled that we were able to make that work. Here's another straightforward sort of trash fight. Here you can try to take on the Herald, but she's really not going to have any of it. Again, she's scripted to run away either at the point which you defeat all of her other forces, or if you got her down to a certain health threshold. She runs away, puts on her magic shield that makes her invulnerable to any further attacks, and summons these warhounds. I will say this village is also one of the things that changed. It used to be that you started, this used to be a Zephyrite village, and you used to start the instance in this village where the Forged were doing this attack. And it was since changed to be, an Alonian village, and then you are starting outside of it and working your way inside. So that was one of the things that changed. I think it felt weird to us to not introduce the Alonian population right away. We initially, I think, thought, and I don't think it's a bad thought to have, that introducing you to a faction that you already had come across in the game, which was the Zephyrite, would have been a good choice. But yeah, ultimately I think it was maybe too confusing, or just it felt a little disingenuous because the Zephyrite weren't here; it was just their village that was being attacked, which also didn't really make a lot of sense because why would Forge attack a mostly empty village? There were a few stragglers and people who were scavenging in the village that you had to save. I think this works out much better. So I already pretty much defeated this boss fight, but I'll talk a little bit about it now after the fact. These Forged Warhounds went through a lot of different changes. They used to be much, much harder than they ended up being. The pyramid attack that you might have seen, where they reflect damage back at you, they did that all the time initially, and that was really brutal. That killed players almost instantly every time, and I initially was comfortable with that because I wanted there to be some level of challenge because the Herald so far had, like I said, been mostly a theatrical performance and not an actual combat encounter so much. So there was an attempt by me to have an additional level of difficulty added here. We walked it back because feedback was roundly negative. Everyone hated how the boss fight went because they were like, I don't understand why I'm getting spiked down, and I would just look at them and be like, well, pay attention to the enemy's health bar. You can see that he's got to reflect on, and you're basically killing yourself. So that's because your DPS is so high, which, I mean, a lot of people internally, when we play test, we oftentimes use gear that's like super high DPS. So it's really easy to spike things down. But yeah, then a reflect in that scenario does the opposite of what I think a lot of players expect, which is they spike themselves down. So yeah, I think what ended up shipping is probably on the easy side, if I'm being honest. But I don't know. That could be because I've played this literally about 1,000 times. I playtest the heck out of my content. I'm a stickler about that. I can't let this stuff go and just be like, oh, I've coded this, and now I'm going to put this off in the hands of QA and let them find all the problems. I don't ever want to be that kind of designer, so I would play this religiously, probably 100 times a day. It feels like 100 times a day sometimes. It's probably not that much, but that's what it feels like. All right, so we get our next objective, which is to save the village from burning because the Forged have retreated, and we've defeated those evil bastards. But we now need to help save the village. So we have Fidus, who approaches us here. He gives us his fire extinguisher, which is another, callback to Keel's line about wanting extra insurance because she knows that wherever the commander goes, they create chaos. So yeah, so we get this fire extinguisher and we use it to put out the fire, and we can use mounts with it. Getting that to work right was an interesting implementation challenge, let me say. Actually, let me talk about that real quick. The fire extinguisher was not a fire extinguisher for the longest time. It was these buckets, which I still have here because if you're playing with other people, non-instance owners will not get the fire extinguisher. And so we needed a way to have, non-instance owners also be able to put out fires and help save the village. So we did that initially, where you grabbed buckets and ran around and put fires out with a bucket. But there were two major problems with that. One is putting out these big ass fires with a tiny little bucket never feels good. It always feels a little fake. Now we do this all over the game, so I wasn't too concerned that it was a huge sort of narrative disconnect, because again, we've established these are sort of magical buckets, I guess, full of way more water than could possibly be held in the structure of it. But the second thing that was problematic is that in order to pick up the water bucket, you have to interact. And interacting on a mount, as you have seen, dismounts you. And so there was no real good way to do that without forcing the player to dismount all the time. And we really wanted to try to avoid that if we could. I say try to avoid that because we didn't end up avoiding that. The fire extinguisher has the same problem in that if you want to use the fire extinguisher, you have to get off, use the fire extinguisher, and then you can get back on the mount. The difference is that with the fire extinguisher, I could store it. So I put it on your back, and you technically still, you don't actually have the fire extinguisher at this point. I just make it look like you do by putting it on, putting a buff effect on your back that looks like the fire extinguisher. Hey, dev tricks. But yeah, I think it's unavoidable that you have to get off the mount because I prototyped that. I prototyped using the fire extinguisher on the mount, and there were so many problems with it. One is that when you, little technical note, when you're on the mount, you're technically now in a transform that makes you sit on the saddle. And the transform does not play nicely or have the right animations for using a bundle weapon because the transform is a very specific animation state. It can only exist in and it's a more complex transformation than other transformations in that it reacts to the mount and it does sort of mirror your animations to what the mount's motion set is. So there's that, but the mount doesn't have a fire weapon animation from its back. So there was nothing I could use to have that happen. So one of two things would have happened. Either the fire extinguisher spray would come out of your face, which looked comical and funny, but wasn't appropriate. Or even worse, it came out of the root of the mount, which just happened to be right here under its belly. So it made it look like the raptor. In this case, I'm running a griffin, so it probably wouldn't look the same. But if I was on my raptor, the spray would come out from right here. Yeah, and so it looked like you were having the raptor pee on the fires to put them out, which I thought was hilarious, and I would have actually been comfortable shipping that, quite honestly, as goofy as that was. But we are a T for teen game, and I think showing urination probably puts us over the top of the rating in that regard. So I think we couldn't have done that, even if we wanted to. Yeah. It was a challenge to work on getting players onto mounts in this area because so much of what you're doing to progress this heart is getting off the mount. You know, you have to get off the mount to revive people. You have to get off the mount to put out fires. And so, but in the end, we kind of came to the realization that it's okay because getting on and off the mount is part of learning how to use the mount. Because that's, you know, it's not like you can stay on the mount forever in the open world. You have to get off the mount to talk to NPCs. You have to get off the mount to do certain things, to interact with objects. So part of learning the mount is learning that you have to get on and off of it. So I was totally okay, and I think we argued that that was actually a good thing, to have a good balance between using the mount, riding the mount to access this upper area, because you need the mount to access this upper area and get across these broken platforms, right? So you have to use the mount to do that. But also teaching players that in order to do certain actions, you have to get off the mount and, you know, do those actions, and then you get back on the mount. So it was all part of the tutorialization of this that I thought was something that we wanted to make sure we taught players. All right. What else can I say? It's a subtle little thing, but I'm pretty proud of it. I ended up doing this thing where there's all these fires, and each of these fires, when you put them out, does a decrement of some percentage on the environment zone, because if you look in the sky, there's a bunch of sort of flame effects and smoke effects in the sky. This environment zone was tuned very specifically for the village being on fire. So the more fires you put out, the more clear the sky gets and the less smoke there is in the atmosphere. And it's a subtle thing, but I'm really quite happy that I was able to do that. It wasn't something that was, you know, it's not the kind of thing that I think we often do. But I thought it was important to do that here. So as you see now, most of the fires are out now. So in fact, I think all of it. No, one fire is still there. But it's blue sky again, because one fire by itself is not going to pollute the air the way that, you know, dozens of them would. All right, and then what else can I say? Yeah, the renown heart. So I think this is the first time we put a renown heart inside a story instance, and that was interesting because it's technically a renown heart, but not a renown heart, because renown hearts are added to your character record typically. They are things that, you know, add to map completion and world completion out in the open world. And so what do you do with one that doesn't add to world completion or map completion? Well, you have to make a heart that isn't a heart. And so that's what that is. It's a renown heart. It functions exactly like a renown heart, with the exception that it is orphaned off into its own sort of space and time pocket, I guess you would call it, because it doesn't actually do anything. It has the reward structure, but you don't get any karma out of it. You get a little bit of a coin boost. Oxium does turn into a heart vendor at the end, but he just offers the one thing.
Are you sure? One less raptor is the least of our problems.
Yeah, so that was interesting. That took some tech as well. We had to get a flag on renown hearts that allowed us to have a renown heart that didn't track on the player's character record. So get on our mount here. We'll leave. One of the things I definitely pushed for to have here is I wanted to see that there was an actual cost of this battle. Not everybody, you saved a bunch of people, and that's great. That does make you a hero. But some people were in the fire for too long, and we can't obviously show gruesome corpses and charred bodies because we are a T for teen game, and that would again be probably too far. But I just kept some of these villagers dead, and they are fully dead, and people in the village are mourning them. Yeah, because again, I wanted to see that the Herald did do an awful thing, and did accomplish at least part of her mission, which is to make us hopefully feel a little bit bad that we weren't in time to save everybody. It's a challenge. We're a game that is not super dark and serious, but I do want us to have elements of that sometimes in our storytelling. So I put that in there for that. All right. And now we get to the mines. The creatures in this mine used to actually be forged hatchlings, the forgelings. I can't remember what they're called. They're like the little forge devourer type looking guys. And that never really felt good because the other forged all retreated away from the village. And so it didn't really make sense that they'd still be hanging out here. So I just filled this cave with cave spiders because cave spiders are creepy, and also, I liked selling the idea that raptors are naturally afraid of spiders. Potentially, I don't know that that's canonical, so don't take my word for that. But that was my sort of reasoning behind why I have these raptors here who are trapped by spiders because they're too afraid. Unfortunately, raptors don't have a cowering animation, or I would have put that on them. Hopefully there's enough there that it sells. And these guys are just little squishy guys. really what this is it's a tutorial area again to teach players how to use the engage skill. Um, I can't remember if I kept this, but there was an achievement at one point to use to take out each of those group of spiders with a single engage. Um, I scripted those little spiderlings to uh, spread out and then all gather together real quick and then spread out again. And they did that on a loop because I wanted to, again, teach players, oh, when they all gather together, if I use my engage skill, I can do the tail swipe and it'll take out all of them at once. Um, and so there's an achievement to do that. I actually don't remember if I kept that achievement in or not. I may have. But yeah, this whole area was specifically designed to be a not a threatening area, but just a way to teach the engage skill in a sort of friendly, non-threatening fashion. I put some optional character dialogues. I don't know how many people ever discover these. You know, the miners are grateful that you ran the forged off because now they can get back to work. Although in the open world, they're now plagued by Choya, so maybe the Forge were keeping the Choya at bay and we've made things worse. I don't know. There's a couple characters over here who have a neat little conversation. They talk about one of the things we wanted to have in this expansion was that different people in Alona think differently about Balthazar. That we see Balthazar as an enemy. We see him as a rampaging god of war. But these people only know that he's come down to kill the crystal dragon, which has plagued them for countless generations, potentially. I mean, really only the last, 10 years in the world's history that he's been active down here. But nonetheless, they're well aware of the crystal dragon, his influence, because Glint had her home here. And so, that's always been a shadow over their heads. So Balthazar coming to take on the crystal dragon kind of seems like a good thing, right? So there are people here who are like, look, yeah, Balthazar is doing some crazy shit, but as long as you stay out of his way, you're going to be fine. And, just don't get in the forged way, and we're going to be okay. And other people who are like, no, I think that this guy is crazy. So we wanted to have a little bit of representation of that here, and introduce ourselves to some locals. I think it's just, again, it's just we've tried really hard with Path of Fire to focus a lot on attention to detail like this, to where you are, getting a lot more out of the story, hopefully, than simply what's right in your face.
I'll check it out. See what help I can find.
We're gonna head down to Amnoon.
Hearing you. Some interference. Try get higher ground if you can.
Higher ground? Oh, right. If you can hear me, I'll try to reach
Tirza Bauer was the map artist for this area. She is one of the more amazing map artists at ArenaNet. She is still there, probably kicking butt, making kick-ass maps again. I think all of our map artists are phenomenal, but Tirza is, I think, one of the people that I just have enjoyed working the most with, because she's just got such a great eye for story and how the environments that she's creating help tell that story. So that run-in where you get to see the city for the first time is just, it's one of those great moments, I think, in our game.
A village north of here was attacked. My crew is helping
All right,
survivors, but they could use
we're
ammunition.
meeting here with Captain Raheem.
Wait here.
There's not a lot much left to talk about here. We have our NPCs, our iconics rather, Casimir and Ritlock show up to greet us. They've been here for a little while, and they help vouch for us, and we get to meet up with them. We're going to be joining them for the bulk of this expansion, so we introduce them here. There's not a lot of material here. It's lore and storytelling here now at this point. There's a neat little thing at the end of this where you get to hint at Ritlock's secret, which, as I had mentioned in previous playthroughs, Ritlock has been keeping a secret which we will find out more about in Chapter 4. But at this point, we know that a lot of players are upset that we have still not answered Ritlock's story and delved into his background when he went into the mists.
Can I still call you that?
I wanted to acknowledge that here. I wanted to have a moment where you can challenge Ritlock and say, hey, it's awesome that you're here, but, you know, are you finally going to tell me what the hell happened to you and where you were and what's going on? And so there's this great character moment between you and Ritlock. And, you know, you're like, look, this is the last time I'm taking no for an answer. And I put that there because I think it was really important that we sort of put the words of the player into the commander's mouth. That doesn't always happen. It's usually the other way around, where the commander is sort of informing the player of story and important character moments. But in this case, I thought it was important that the player sort of embody, or the character of the commander rather, embody the player and their desire to say, hey, Ritlock has shown up again, finally. Is he finally going to be ready to tell us what the hell his story was? And it's not only in the VO, but then I added a second follow-up conversation with him where he's like, what? You know, and he's grumpy because you're like, look, I really want to know what happened to you in the mists. And again, this is a bit of a redundant conversation dialogue, but I don't know. I felt like I wanted a little bit extra oomph to it of like, look, I will finally tell you. I will tell you in this expansion. Just hold your horses.
Timey tried
Yeah.
to reach you before I
So that's
left.
what I did there.
Now I understand why she didn't have any luck.
I wanted to have this moment with Kaz and the commander as well, because there was some disconnect the last time we saw Marjorie and Casimir together. They, you know, there seemed to be some friction between the two, so I wanted to address that and also explain what Kaz is doing here and what her feelings are about Balthazar and her faith. Some people felt that her faith kind of came out of nowhere. I can understand where that would come from. I think because we had never seen Casimir
And I respect that.
really be super devotional. I don't think that necessarily tracks, because I know people in my personal life who I never thought of as religious, and then one day I found out that they go to church and they pray and they do this stuff, and it's like they just never felt like telling me. Perhaps because I'm an atheist and they didn't feel comfortable talking to me about that. But so I don't think it's unusual, I guess, for some people to keep their faith and their beliefs close to the vest. I think Casimir is that type of person, and I think it wasn't until one of her gods literally walked out of the mists and in front of her eyes that she now has to sort of be put at odds with this faith that up until now I think she kept internally and had this belief in her heart. And I think now she was confronted with it. She sort of had to take it out and say, well, now what do I believe? That my God is standing right before me now. I can't necessarily hide this part of myself anymore. I was never super religious before, that's true, but you know, so I added this extra conversation as well. So each of them has like two layers, a VO layer and a non-VO layer of added conversation and exposition. Maybe it's too much, but again, I'd rather, I guess my personal thing is I'd rather err on the side of more and not less. But there's something to be said for less is more sometimes too. This is just one of those times where it's optional conversation. You don't have to do it, so might as well add to it. All right, so that's the end of the instance. The last thing I'll just call attention to is we, with Path of Fire, made a concerted effort to sync up your exit point in the instance with the entry point in the open world. So here we drop out in almost exactly the same spot that we left the instance, so that way it feels like there's a good continuity across the board. All right, so that is Sparking the Flame. And yeah, so Chapter 1 of Path of Fire, I think despite how many iterations of this chapter I went through, I think this was by far the best one that we had. So I think that the amount of time that we spent working on it and getting feedback and going back and forth definitely paid dividends. I think that's a strong opening chapter. I don't think it's the best in terms of mechanics or gameplay design, because again, it was not designed for that. It was designed to facilitate players easily getting the Raptor and getting them through a quick tutorial, and then getting them out into the open world for them to be able to jump around on the Raptor, explore at their leisure, and just go to town, literally, and visit a place that a long time Guild Wars players haven't seen in a long time. So I think that from that standpoint, I'm happy with it. I think it succeeded on all of those fronts, and I think that it introduced the Herald in a nice way without it being too overly dramatic. And so, yeah, I'm quite happy with it. I think it's one of my strongest pieces of content. I'm very proud of it. I hope that you got something out of hearing my behind-the-scenes discussion about it. And yeah, we will be back next time again with Chapter 3. Yes, Chapter 3, Night of Fires, of Path of Fire. And yeah, if you like my videos, go ahead and click the like and subscribe video. And again, I have a new website. It's www.mindfulgamedesign.com. I just updated it again this morning, added some of my screenplay stuff up there. And yeah, I'll continue to add to that as time goes on. Anyway, that's it for me for today. I will look forward to seeing you all next time on Design Deconstructed. Thank you.